Yes, so we're having yet another working group in the ENVRI-FAIR, and this one is on data licenses, citation, and use tracking, which is led jointly by Keith, Jeffrey, and me. Yes, and I'm going to present what we have been coming up with during our work. I'm also realizing that I'm the one standing between you and your weekend, so I'm trying to be brief and to the point. Yes, so what are the objectives of this working group? Metadata for data and metadata licenses. So what do we need to describe licenses sufficiently and also use restrictions? The second objective of our working group is data citations, and so we should have a scheme for doing two things. One for tracking data use, but also easily cite data sets or data set collections. And the last objective is what should we do about data use tracking? How can we make progress with tracking data use through publications or articles or other forms of publications, but also through use in VREs. So first, a bit of motivation, license metadata. Why are we looking at that again? So many metadata schemas are containing items describing the license attached to a data item. But these have sometimes shortcomings. If you, for example, use a citation string, these are normally not machine actionable, and they can't handle really attribution stacking well, besides concatenating the string. And that's a disadvantage, which I'm going to get back to. There's also an implicit declaration of attribution. Current metadata schemas track different entities being involved in data creation, like the creator, publisher, and contributors. But they don't really say anything whom of these are supposed to be attributed when you have an attribution license, for example. So you can the only selection you have is attribute all, but quite often that's not really what you want. Third point is also, as mentioned, attribution stacking. Why is attribution stacking important for us? RIs are dependent on data use KPIs. So they need to make visible that data are being used. So attribution for RIs is really essential. It's key. If you have attribution, it leads to attribution stacking. So instead of demonizing attribution stacking, we should find a way of making it as easy and painless as possible. And also, quite often you have a mix of a license and other use constraints, which, sometimes merge into one record, which can lead to incomplete records. So what can we do about that? So the aim of this working group is to identify the license and the attributed entities in a machine actionable way, allow machine action attribution, and also to distinguish between metadata for license and generic use constraints. So quite obviously, we need to either distinguish between the license and use constraints, need to separate those also in the metadata records and in the metadata items. But obviously also, if we are looking at metadata for licensed metadata and metadata for the license on the metadata itself, those can obviously be the same. So what are the items that we think are necessary to describe a license properly? So here comes the list of metadata items. First of all, a license metadata is not obligatory. You can have a license or you cannot. You can also have several licenses on the same item. First of all, that's mandatory. You need a license identifier. Also here, maybe you're supposed to use preferred vocabulary lists, so they exist. You need a link to the license to identify it properly. And then very importantly, the attribution. The entity to be attributed is supposed to be identified with a PID. It should include the role that the entity is involved in creating the data. And if you do this, it also enables attribution stacking. It's easy to find out whether an entity is already attributed or not, so you're not adding text in a repetitive manner. You should also include room for the licensor in case the licensor needs to be or wants to be identified. And quite importantly, also the licensee, you should, in case you don't not only want them to address the general public, but you want to restrict the license to an entity, you should also be able to identify this entity. And last not least, also a valid from date, and that covers the use case of an embargo period. So a date from which the license becomes active. The items on use constraint data are a little bit more limited. They're more generic. You're supposed to have a title, link to the resource, acknowledgement, but also here we included the option of machine actionable attribution, because that's so important for our AIs to be visible, that to make visible that the data is being used. Data citation. How do we envisage data citation? Here we are having an approach of a stacked approach of primary identifiers, and these are supposed to identify data in a repository with a homogeneous granularity, and these are also going to be the basis for data use tracking. The second part of this approach is then the data collection DOI or PID. Here the work is based on previous work that RDA has been doing, and collection DOIs are supposed to point back to the primary DOIs to enable tracking and quantifying data use. Data use tracking, that's the last point on our agenda. So how are we envisaging that is supposed to work? We have infrastructures in place that are operating what they call a research graph, a collection of objects and how they are interlinked, a collection of metadata records and who is quoting whom. And these infrastructures are, for example, OpenAIR, but also Crossref, which is an initiative by the commercial publishers. We also recently have had the EU project FAIR, which developed a concept for extending these research graphs and from DOIs also to more generic PIDs. So how are we envisaging using this? In the center of this graph here, you see the research infrastructure. The infrastructure has its repository with all the DOIs and PIDs that repository contains. On the other hand, you have the indexing agencies like OpenAIR and Crossref who are maintaining the research graph. And the idea is now that the research infrastructure gets access to these to the research graph and can request a quantification from that research graph how often each DOI'd item in the repository is being used. And based on that, the infrastructure can then set up a budget of how often that is being used based on contributing institute or PI or by country or even by research platform. So what have we come up with? We have created a license metadata specification, which includes dedicated attribution and attribution stacking. We developed an approach for easy citation of the data, but also for quantifying data use. And we also, at least have an idea of how we can facilitate accounting of data use by collaboration with the indexing agencies maintaining their research graphs. So much from me. Questions?